Ma'am, I need you to move to the back where you belong. First class isn't for people like you.
The words cut through the cabin of United Airways Flight 847 like a blade sharp and deliberate. Tiffany Brooks stood in the aisle, her perfectly pressed uniform crisp against her slender frame, her manicured finger pointing dismissively at the woman seated quietly in 2A. The accusation hung in the air, heavy with contempt and assumption. Passengers throughout the first-class cabin turned to stare. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The soft hum of pre-departure preparations seemed to pause as every eye focused on the unfolding confrontation. This was United Airways Flight 847, a Tuesday evening departure from Denver International Airport bound for Miami, delayed 45 minutes due to weather, but now ready for what should have been a routine cross-country journey. But nothing about this moment felt routine. The woman in seat 2A didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice or storm out in indignation. Instead, she looked up from the thick manual she'd been reading, her dark eyes meeting Tiffany's gaze with a calmness that seemed almost unsettling. There was something in that look, something that suggested this wasn't the first time she'd faced this kind of treatment, and it wouldn't be the last. "I understand there might be some confusion," the woman said quietly, her voice carrying a subtle authority that didn't match her simple appearance. "Perhaps we could resolve this without disturbing the other passengers." Tiffany's jaw tightened. The audacity of this woman trying to negotiate when she'd clearly been caught red-handed, attempting to steal a seat that cost more than most people's monthly rent. This was exactly the kind of situation that separated professional flight attendants from amateurs. The woman sitting in seat 2A was Diane Roberts, and at 52 years old, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that spoke of decades spent in situations where composure meant the difference between life and death. Her appearance offered no hint of her extraordinary background. She wore a simple navy jacket that had seen better days, practical black slacks that prioritized function over fashion, and worn leather shoes that suggested someone who spent more time working than shopping. Her canvas messenger bag, faded and weathered, sat tucked beneath the seat in front of her. Inside that unremarkable bag were documents that could clear runways at airports around the world, but tonight they remained hidden beneath ordinary travel necessities. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her hands, calloused from years of technical work, rested calmly on the thick aviation manual she'd been studying. Most passengers would have assumed she was perhaps a government clerk, maybe a teacher, or possibly someone's mother traveling to visit family. They would have been wrong on all counts, but Diane had long ago learned the value of being underestimated. In her previous life, anonymity had been a survival skill. In retirement, it had become her preferred way of moving through the world. The manual she'd been reading wasn't light travel literature. It was a technical document on emergency aviation procedures, the kind of material that would put most people to sleep within minutes. But Diane read it with the focused attention of someone for whom such information wasn't academic theory, but practical knowledge that had once meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Her boarding pass, tucked into her jacket pocket, clearly showed seat 38C in the economy section. She had no business being in first class, at least not according to the ticket she'd purchased. But Diane Roberts had learned long ago that sometimes the rules that appeared to govern a situation weren't the only rules in play. She'd been watching the cabin crew since boarding, noting their procedures, their attention to detail, their treatment of different passengers. What she'd observed hadn't surprised her, but it had confirmed suspicions she'd hoped might prove unfounded. Some lessons, she reflected sadly, took longer to learn than others. As the confrontation developed around her, Diane found herself thinking not about the inconvenience of being moved to her assigned seat, but about the broader implications of what was happening. She'd spent her career in environments where split-second decisions could save or cost lives, where accurate assessment of people's capabilities was essential for mission success. The assumptions being made about her tonight were exactly the kind of thinking that got people killed in the field. But this wasn't the field, and these weren't life or death stakes. This was just another evening flight, another opportunity for small-minded prejudice to reveal itself in ways that would be embarrassing for everyone involved once the truth came out. Diane glanced briefly toward the cockpit door, her protective instincts automatically assessing the professionalism and competence of the crew who would be responsible for everyone's safety during the flight. She hoped for everyone's sake that they were better at flying planes than they were at treating passengers with basic human dignity. Tiffany Brooks had been a flight attendant with United Airways for 6 years, and in that time she'd developed what she considered a professional eye for trouble. At 28, she took pride in her ability to maintain order in the cabin to ensure that the premium experience promised to first-class passengers was delivered without disruption or compromise. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her makeup applied with precision, and her uniform pressed to crisp perfection. She'd worked hard to earn her position on the premier routes, the flights that carried executives, celebrities, and other important passengers who expected and deserved the highest level of service. Protecting that exclusivity wasn't just part of her job description, it was a point of personal pride. She'd seen too many situations where passengers tried to game the upgrade system, sneaking into seats they hadn't paid for, hoping that crew members would be too busy or too polite to enforce the rules. In Tiffany's experience, these seat upgraders fell into predictable categories. There were the college students who hoped their youth and charm might earn them a free pass to better accommodations. There were the business travelers who acted entitled and hoped aggression might intimidate crew members into compliance. And then there were passengers like the woman in 2A who seemed to think that quiet confidence could substitute for a valid ticket. Tiffany had dealt with all these types before, and she'd developed strategies for handling each one. The key was to be firm but professional, to make it clear that rules existed for a reason and wouldn't be bent simply because someone hoped they might be. She'd received commendations from supervisors for her attention to detail and her commitment to maintaining cabin standards. Her approach to passenger relations was shaped by training that emphasized the importance of recognizing potential security threats and unauthorized access attempts. She'd been taught to trust her instincts about passengers who seemed out of place, who didn't fit the profile of typical first-class travelers. The woman in 2A hit every marker on that mental checklist. Everything about her appearance suggested economy class, from her inexpensive clothing to her practical accessories. Her reading material, while Tiffany couldn't see the title, clearly looked like the kind of technical manual that suggested government work or blue-collar employment. Her entire presentation screamed "doesn't belong here" in a way that made Tiffany's professional alarm bells ring loudly. What bothered Tiffany most was the woman's calm demeanor. In her experience, passengers who'd been caught in unauthorized seats typically responded with either immediate compliance and embarrassment or defensive anger. This woman's measured response suggested someone who thought she could talk her way out of a clear violation of airline policy. Tiffany had no intention of letting that happen. Maintaining the integrity of the first-class experience meant enforcing boundaries, and that's exactly what she intended to do. In the cockpit of Flight 847, Captain Miguel Hernandez was reviewing weather reports and feeling the familiar weight of responsibility that came with carrying 247 passengers and crew through challenging conditions. At 48, he'd been flying commercial aircraft for 20 years, building a reputation for steady professionalism and safety-first decision-making. His Hispanic heritage had occasionally created challenges in an industry that hadn't always welcomed diversity in leadership positions. But his competence and dedication had earned respect from colleagues and passengers alike. Tonight's weather delays had put the flight behind schedule, which meant potential cascade effects throughout the system. Hernandez prided himself on making up time in the air when possible, but never at the expense of safety. He'd been monitoring reports of turbulence ahead and making mental contingency plans for route adjustments that might be necessary during the flight. His first officer, Brandon Kelly, was 35 years old, with 8 years of experience and a reputation for careful attention to detail. Kelly approached every flight with the kind of by-the-book precision that mly him an ideal partner for a captain like Hernandez who valued thoroughness over shortcuts. Kelly was currently working through pre-flight checks with methodical efficiency, noting minor instrument variations that probably meant nothing but deserved monitoring. In the passenger cabin, the confrontation developing in first class had caught the attention of several travelers. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a 45-year-old cardiologist from Denver, sat in seat 1B, with her husband watching the situation unfold with growing interest. Dr. Reynolds had built her medical practice around attention to detail and adherence to proper procedures, qualities that made her sympathetic to crew members trying to maintain order and standards. Marcus Sullivan occupied seat 3A, his expensive Italian suit and platinum watch marking him as someone accustomed to first-class accommodations and the exclusivity they represented. At 58, Sullivan had built a successful consulting business, partly by understanding the importance of maintaining boundaries and ensuring that people stayed in their appropriate places within organizational hierarchies. The situation developing in front of him struck him as exactly the kind of boundary testing that needed to be addressed firmly and immediately. Elena Vasquez, a 34-year-old travel blogger from San Antonio, was seated in 4C with her laptop open preparing to document her flight experience for her social media followers. Elena had built her online presence around authentic travel experiences and honest reviews of airline service, including both positive and negative aspects of customer treatment. What she was witnessing tonight struck her as potentially significant, the kind of situation that might deserve broader attention. Each of these passengers brought their own perspectives and prejudices to the unfolding situation, their responses shaped by personal experiences and assumptions about how the world should work. United Airways Flight 847 was a Boeing 777 configured for long-haul domestic routes with 32 first-class seats, 48 business-class seats, and over 200 economy seats stretching back through the main cabin. The first-class section featured wide leather seats with generous legroom premium meal service and an atmosphere of quiet exclusivity that justified the significant price premium over economy accommodations. The cabin lighting was dimmed to evening settings, creating pools of warm light around individual seats, while maintaining the subdued ambiance that first-class passengers expected. The air carried the subtle sense of leather upholstery and the premium meals being prepared in the galley, along with the faint underlying smell of jet fuel and recycled air that marked every commercial flight. Outside the windows, Denver International Airport stretched across the Colorado landscape, its distinctive peaked terminal buildings visible in the distance. The weather that had delayed their departure was moving east, leaving behind clear skies that promised a smooth initial climb but potentially challenging conditions later in the flight as they crossed into areas still affected by the storm system. The passenger manifest showed a typical Tuesday evening mix of business travelers heading home from meetings, families visiting relatives, and individuals whose travel purposes remained known only to themselves. The first-class cabin tended to attract passengers who valued privacy and discretion, creating an environment where personal interactions were minimized and individual space was respected. Tonight's atmosphere, however, was charged with tension that went beyond normal pre-departure preparations. The weather delays had left passengers irritable, and crew members stressed about schedule pressures. Gate agents had dealt with frustrated travelers demanding upgrades or compensation for the inconvenience, creating a ripple effect of negativity that followed passengers onto the aircraft. The confrontation developing in seat 2A was drawing attention throughout the cabin, creating the kind of public spectacle that most passengers preferred to avoid when traveling. But human nature being what it was, few could resist watching a situation that seemed to confirm their own assumptions about airline travel passenger behavior and social boundaries. Before we dive deeper into this story, tell me where you're watching from today. Drop your city in the comments below. And if you've ever been judged by your appearance before people knew who you really were, this story is going to hit close to home. Make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will change how you think about making assumptions about strangers. "Excuse me," Tiffany said, moving closer to seat 2A with what she considered her most professional smile, though the expression didn't reach her eyes. "I need to see your boarding pass immediately, please." The request carried the weight of authority delivered in the tone that Tiffany had perfected for dealing with passengers who needed to understand that airline policies weren't suggestions to be negotiated. She stood in the aisle with perfect posture, her hands clasped behind her back, projecting the kind of confidence that came from 6 years of dealing with every type of passenger behavior imaginable. Diane Roberts looked up from her manual meeting, Tiffany's gaze with steady composure. There was no surprise in her expression, no indication that the request was unexpected. Instead, she reached into her jacket pocket with deliberate calm and produced a standard United Airways boarding pass. "Of course," Diane said quietly, extending the document without hesitation. Tiffany took the boarding pass and examined it with theatrical thoroughness, though the relevant information was immediately obvious. United Airways Flight 847, Seat 38C Economy Class. The evidence was exactly what she'd expected to find confirmation of what her professional instincts had told her from the moment she'd noticed the woman sitting where she didn't belong. "I thought so," Tiffany said, her voice gaining confidence as she realized that several first-class passengers had begun paying attention to the confrontation. This was exactly the kind of teachable moment that demonstrated the value of vigilant crew members who weren't afraid to enforce standards. "Ma'am, you're clearly in the wrong section. Your assigned seat is in the back of the aircraft, row 38. The phrase "back of the aircraft" was delivered with particular emphasis designed to make clear the social and economic distance between where the woman was sitting and where she belonged. Tiffany had found that precision in language helped establish appropriate expectations and reduce the likelihood of further argument or confusion. Diane's expression didn't change. She didn't show embarrassment at being caught, didn't offer immediate compliance, and didn't display the defensive anger that Tiffany often encountered in these situations. Instead, she maintained the same calm demeanor that had characterized her response to the initial request. "I understand the confusion," Diane said, her voice maintaining the same measured tone. "There was a last-minute seating change arranged through the gate. Perhaps you could check with Captain Hernandez about the adjustment." The suggestion landed like a challenge in the increasingly tense atmosphere of the first-class cabin. Several passengers who had been pretending not to listen now turned openly to watch the exchange, recognizing that the situation had escalated beyond a simple misunderstanding about seat assignments. Tiffany felt her professional demeanor crack slightly. The audacity of this woman, caught red-handed in an obvious violation of seating policy, to suggest that she, a senior flight attendant with 6 years of experience, needed to bother the captain with something as basic as unauthorized seat occupation was not just insulting but ridiculous. "Ma'am," Tiffany said, her voice sharpening despite her efforts to maintain professional control, "I don't need to check with anyone about this situation. This is clearly a case of unauthorized seat occupation, and I need you to gather your belongings and move to your assigned seat immediately." The command was delivered with the kind of finality that usually ended such confrontations. But Diane Roberts didn't move. She didn't argue or become defensive, but she also didn't comply with the direct instruction to relocate. Instead, she continued to sit calmly in seat 2A, her manual still open in her lap, her expression unchanged. The standoff stretched for several seconds that felt much longer, creating an uncomfortable tension that rippled through the first-class cabin as passengers began to realize they were witnessing something more significant than a routine seating dispute. Tiffany's training at United Airways had included extensive instruction on passenger safety, emergency procedures, and customer service protocols. But it had also included less formal guidance on maintaining the kind of cabin environment that justified premium pricing for first-class accommodations. Part of that environment involved ensuring that passengers who paid top dollar for exclusive seating didn't have their experience degraded by the presence of individuals who didn't belong. The airline had developed what they called passenger experience protocols that helped crew members identify and address situations where unauthorized passengers might compromise the premium atmosphere that first-class travelers expected. While these protocols were never explicitly discriminatory, they emphasized the importance of vigilance in maintaining appropriate standards and boundaries. Tiffany had internalized these lessons completely. In her experience, passengers who attempted to occupy seats they hadn't paid for typically shared certain characteristics. They dressed inappropriately for the first-class environment, they seemed uncomfortable with premium amenities, and they often appeared nervous or defensive when questioned about their presence. The woman in 2A hit every marker on that mental checklist. Security should have caught this at boarding, Tiffany muttered, though she spoke loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear her assessment of the situation. People like you always try this kind of thing, hoping crew members will be too busy to notice or too polite to enforce the rules. The phrase "people like you" hung in the air with unmistakable implication. While Tiffany would have insisted if challenged that she was referring to seat upgraders, generally the racial undertones were obvious to everyone within hearing distance. This wasn't just about seating policy. It was about assumptions, prejudices, and the kind of thinking that reduced individuals to stereotypes. From seat 1B, Dr. Patricia Reynolds nodded approvingly at Tiffany's firm stance. As someone who had worked hard to earn her professional success and the financial rewards that came with it, Dr. Reynolds had little patience for people who tried to get something for nothing. The discipline required to maintain medical practice standards was similar in her mind to the discipline required to maintain appropriate social boundaries. "In my day, people knew their place," Dr. Reynolds said to her husband, though her voice carried clearly to surrounding seats. "Now everyone thinks they're entitled to special treatment regardless of whether they've earned it or can afford it." Marcus Sullivan looked up from his champagne and chuckled, recognizing the situation as exactly the kind of boundary testing that he'd encountered throughout his business career. In his experience, allowing people to transgress established rules inevitably led to broader problems with order and respect for authority. "Another seat upgrader trying to get something for nothing," he commented to his seatmate loud enough for everyone nearby to hear his assessment. "Security should be tighter about this sort of thing. These people are getting bolder about taking what doesn't belong to them." The collective response from first-class passengers created an environment of unanimous support for Tiffany's position. From their perspective, the situation was straightforward. An economy passenger had attempted to steal a first-class experience, been caught by vigilant crew members, and was now trying to talk her way out of the consequences through manipulation and false claims about authorization. Diane Roberts listened to the comments with the same calm expression she'd maintained throughout the confrontation. She'd heard similar assessments before in different contexts and different circumstances from people who looked at her appearance and background and made assumptions about her capabilities, her integrity, and her right to occupy spaces they considered exclusive. "I understand your concern about maintaining standards," Diane said quietly, addressing Tiffany directly but speaking loudly enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "Perhaps I could speak with Captain Hernandez directly to resolve any confusion about the seating arrangement." Her persistent reference to the captain struck the first-class passengers as particularly audacious. The suggestion that a woman caught attempting seat theft might have legitimate business with the flight crew seemed to confirm their assessment of her as someone who believed that brazen dishonesty might substitute for actual authority or proper documentation. Tiffany's irritation was growing beyond her ability to maintain professional composure. The woman's refusal to accept the obvious reality of her situation, combined with her continued suggestions about involving the captain, was beginning to attract attention from passengers throughout the cabin. This was exactly the kind of disruption that Tiffany prided herself on handling quickly and efficiently. "Ma'am, I want to be very clear about something," Tiffany said, her voice now carrying an edge that hadn't been present at the beginning of the confrontation. "You don't have authorization to be in this seat. You don't have business with the captain, and you don't have any legitimate reason to remain in first class. I need you to gather your belongings immediately and move to your assigned seat, or I'll need to involve additional personnel to resolve this situation. Elena Vasquez had been preparing to document her travel experience for her social media followers when the confrontation in first class began, but what she was witnessing went far beyond typical airline customer service issues. As a travel blogger with over 50,000 followers across multiple platforms, Elena had developed an instinct for recognizing situations that deserved broader attention and documentation. She quietly activated her smartphone's camera and began recording, positioning the device carefully to capture the ongoing exchange without being obvious about her documentation. Her years of creating travel content had taught her how to be discreet while still gathering compelling material, and the situation developing in front of her had all the elements of content that would resonate powerfully with her audience. "This is unbelievable," Elena whispered to herself as she began live streaming the confrontation to her Instagram followers. "We're watching blatant discrimination happen in real time on United Airways Flight 847. A woman is being forced out of first class based purely on assumptions about her appearance." The live stream notification drew immediate attention from her followers, and comments began appearing almost instantly. Viewers were outraged by what they were witnessing, with many sharing similar experiences of being judged or discriminated against based on their appearance or background. Others defended the flight attendant's position, arguing that airline policies existed for valid reasons and needed to be enforced consistently. Elena quickly switched to Twitter and created a hashtag #UnitedShame. Within minutes, the hashtag began trending as her followers shared the content and added their own commentary about airline discrimination and the treatment of passengers based on racial and economic assumptions. "I've been traveling for work for over 10 years, Elena narrated quietly for her live stream audience, "and I've never seen anything this blatant. This woman has been completely calm and respectful, but she's being treated like a criminal because the flight attendant doesn't think she belongs in first class." The response from her social media audience was immediate and intense. Comments poured in from viewers around the world sharing their own experiences with airline discrimination and expressing outrage at what they were witnessing. Many viewers began tagging major news outlets and civil rights organizations, demanding broader coverage of the incident. Elena's documentation was thorough and professional. Her background in travel journalism had taught her the importance of capturing not just the central conflict, but also the reactions of bystanders and the broader context of the situation. She made sure to record the comments from Dr. Reynolds and Marcus Sullivan, recognizing that their support for the discriminatory treatment added important layers to the story. "You can see other first-class passengers openly supporting this discrimination," Elena narrated for her audience. "They're making comments about people like you and knowing your place that make the racial dynamic absolutely clear. This isn't just about seating policy, this is about prejudice and assumptions." The live stream viewer count was climbing rapidly as Elena's followers shared the content across multiple platforms. United Shame was beginning to appear alongside other hashtags related to airline discrimination and civil rights, creating a broader conversation about the treatment of minority passengers in premium travel environments. Elena's phone showed dozens of notifications from major news outlets requesting permission to use her footage and asking for additional information about the flight and passengers involved. The story was developing momentum that would extend far beyond social media, potentially creating significant public relations challenges for United Airways. As she continued documenting the confrontation, Elena found herself thinking about the broader implications of what she was witnessing. This wasn't just about one woman being asked to move seats. It was about the assumptions and prejudices that shaped how people were treated in spaces that were supposed to be professional and equal. "If you're watching this," Elena said to her live stream audience, "please share it. People need to see how discrimination still happens in 2024, how assumptions about appearance and race affect real people in real situations. This woman deserves better, and so do all of us." The growing tension in first class had begun attracting attention from other crew members, and Tiffany felt the pressure of performing her duties under increasingly public scrutiny. When passenger disputes escalated beyond simple conversation, airline protocol required involving senior crew members who could provide additional authority and expertise in conflict resolution. Tiffany pressed the call button for the senior flight attendant, and within moments Rachel Morrison appeared in the first-class cabin. Rachel, 35 years old, with 12 years of experience at United Airways, served as head of cabin crew for Flight 847. She was known for her no-nonsense approach to passenger management and her unwavering support for crew members who enforced airline policies consistently and firmly. "What's the situation?" Tiffany Rachel asked, her voice carrying the kind of professional authority that came from years of dealing with challenging passengers and complex situations. "Unauthorized passenger in seat 2A, Tiffany reported crisply. "Economy ticket attempting to occupy first-class accommodation. She's refusing to move to her assigned seat and claiming some kind of arrangement with the captain." Rachel looked at Diane Roberts with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with every type of passenger behavior imaginable. In her assessment, the situation was straightforward. Economy passenger attempting seat theft caught by vigilant crew member now trying to manipulate the situation through false claims about authorization. "Miss Brooks is absolutely right," Rachel said, addressing Diane directly but speaking loudly enough for surrounding passengers to hear her support for Tiffany's position. "This kind of behavior is completely unacceptable and violates multiple airline policies regarding seat assignments and passenger conduct." The arrival of senior crew support changed the dynamic of the confrontation significantly. What had been a dispute between one flight attendant and one passenger had become an official airline response involving multiple crew members and formal policy enforcement. The situation was escalating beyond simple seat confusion into something that could result in additional consequences for the passenger involved. "Ma'am," Rachel continued, her voice carrying the weight of formal authority, "you need to understand that attempting to occupy seats you haven't paid for is considered theft of services. Beyond that, your refusal to comply with crew instructions violates federal aviation regulations and could result in removal from the flight." Diane Roberts maintained the same calm demeanor she'd displayed throughout the confrontation, but her repeated requests to speak with the captain were becoming more pointed. There was something in her persistence that suggested knowledge of procedures and protocols that went beyond typical passenger understanding. "I appreciate your commitment to following proper procedures," Diane said, addressing both flight attendants with the same measured tone. "That's exactly why I think Captain Hernandez should be consulted about this seating arrangement. I believe he has information that would clarify the situation immediately." Rachel's expression hardened at what she interpreted as continued manipulation and false claims about captain involvement. In her experience, passengers who insisted on speaking with flight crew leadership were typically attempting to use imaginary authority or influence to avoid consequences for their own misconduct. "Ma'am, the captain is busy with pre-flight preparations and safety procedures that are essential for everyone's welfare," Rachel said firmly. "I don't need the captain's permission to enforce basic airline policies, and your continued refusal to comply is becoming a security concern that could affect the safety and comfort of other passengers." The reference to security concerns marked a significant escalation in the airline's response to the situation. Once crew members began framing passenger behavior in terms of security risks, the incident moved into categories that could result in law enforcement involvement and potential criminal charges. Elena Vasquez continued documenting the exchange, her live stream audience growing rapidly as viewers shared the content across social media platforms. Comments were pouring in from around the world, with many viewers expressing outrage at the treatment they were witnessing, and others defending the airline's right to enforce policies and maintain order. "The crew is now treating this woman as a security threat," Elena narrated quietly for her audience. "They're escalating the situation instead of simply checking with the captain like she's requested multiple times. This is becoming a textbook example of how assumptions and prejudice can turn a simple misunderstanding into something much more serious." The hashtag #UnitedShame was trending nationally now, with thousands of users sharing the story and adding their own commentary about airline discrimination and passenger treatment. News outlets were beginning to pick up the story, requesting interviews and additional information about the developing situation. Have you ever stood up for someone being mistreated? Drop a comment because this story gets more intense, and what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about judging people by their appearance. The atmosphere in first class had become charged with tension as the confrontation reached a decision point. Rachel Morrison's declaration that Diane Roberts represented a potential security concern had transformed what began as a seating dispute into an official airline incident requiring immediate resolution. The weight of formal procedures and policy enforcement now hung over the situation like storm clouds. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings immediately," Rachel said, her voice carrying the finality of someone who had exhausted patience and was now moving to enforcement mode. "Your continued refusal to comply with seating assignments and crew instructions has created a situation that affects the safety and comfort of other passengers." Diane Roberts closed her aviation manual with deliberate calm, her movements precise and unhurried despite the escalating pressure around her. She reached beneath the seat to retrieve her canvas messenger bag, handling her possessions with the same measured composure she'd maintained throughout the confrontation. There was something almost ceremonial about her compliance, as if she was participating in a ritual whose outcome was predetermined, but whose completion required her cooperation. Patricia Reynolds watched the removal process with visible satisfaction, nodding approvingly at what she saw as proper enforcement of standards and boundaries. Finally, she said to her husband, though her voice was loud enough for surrounding passengers to hear, "Someone with backbone to maintain the exclusivity that first-class passengers pay for. This is exactly the kind of firm response that keeps airlines professional." Marcus Sullivan had his smartphone out now, taking photos and video of the woman being forced to gather her belongings. "This will make great social media content," he murmured to his seatmate. "Perfect example of what happens when people try to take what they haven't earned. Maybe this will discourage others from attempting similar fraud." His documentation of the incident, which he intended as evidence of proper policy enforcement, was being captured simultaneously by Elena Vasquez for a very different purpose. The contrast between his satisfied recording and Elena's increasingly outraged commentary created parallel narratives of the same event that would soon diverge dramatically across social media platforms. As Diane stood to leave seat 2A, she paused for a moment and looked directly at Rachel Morrison. "I want to make sure I understand the situation correctly," she said quietly. "You're moving me from this seat without consulting Captain Hernandez despite my repeated requests for that consultation?" Her question was delivered without anger or accusation, but something in her tone suggested that the answer would have significance beyond the immediate conflict. There was a quality to her voice that hadn't been present earlier, a subtle shift toward something that sounded almost like professional assessment rather than personal inconvenience. "Ma'am, as I've explained multiple times, the captain doesn't need to be involved in routine passenger seating disputes," Rachel replied, her voice showing strain from the extended confrontation. "Your ticket clearly shows seat 38C, and that's where you belong. This situation has gone on far longer than it should have." Diane nodded once, as if the response had confirmed something she needed to understand. She shouldered her messenger bag and moved into the aisle, beginning the walk toward the economy section that would take her through the full length of the aircraft. But as she passed each row, something in her bearings suggested this wasn't a woman who was accustomed to being dismissed or relocated. Passengers throughout the cabin watched her progress with varying expressions of curiosity, satisfaction, and discomfort. Some seemed pleased to see airline policies being enforced firmly, while others appeared uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation and its obvious racial undertones. The division of opinion created an undercurrent of tension that extended far beyond first class. Elena Vasquez continued her live documentation, narrating the forced removal for her growing online audience. "This dignified woman is being forced to walk the length of the aircraft because flight attendants made assumptions about her appearance and refused to check her story with the captain. The humiliation is intentional and unnecessary." The walk to seat 38C took several minutes, during which Diane maintained the same calm composure that had characterized her response throughout the confrontation. She didn't show embarrassment or anger, didn't pause to argue with passengers who made comments, and didn't display any of the defensive behavior that might have been expected from someone being publicly humiliated. Instead, she moved through the cabin with what could only be described as quiet authority, her posture and bearing, suggesting someone who was participating in this process by choice rather than compulsion. There was something almost protective in the way she glanced occasionally toward the cockpit area, as if her concern extended beyond personal convenience to broader issues of safety and professionalism. When she finally reached row 38, Diane Roberts settled into seat 38C with the same composed dignity she'd displayed throughout the incident. But instead of opening a book or magazine like a typical passenger, she immediately began listening intently to the changing sounds of the aircraft engines, her attention focused on technical details that most passengers would never notice or understand. Elena Vasquez's live stream had exploded across social media platforms, with viral intensity that surprised even her experienced understanding of online engagement. What had started as documentation for her travel blog followers had become a real-time civil rights incident being witnessed by hundreds of thousands of viewers around the world. Her Instagram live stream was showing 45,000 active viewers and climbing rapidly, with comments appearing faster than she could read them. The audience was global, spanning multiple time zones and representing diverse perspectives on airline discrimination, passenger rights, and racial justice. The engagement numbers were unlike anything she'd experienced in her years of travel blogging. "I've been documenting travel experiences for over 8 years," Elena narrated quietly for her audience, "and I've never seen anything like this. We just watched a woman be humiliated and forced to move based purely on assumptions about her appearance and race. This is 2024, and this is happening on a major American airline." The hashtag #UnitedShame had exploded beyond trending status to become a global conversation about airline discrimination. Twitter was showing over 100,000 posts using the hashtag, with major civil rights organizations, celebrities, and news outlets beginning to engage with the content. The story was developing momentum that extended far beyond Elena's original documentation. Comments on her live stream revealed the deep personal impact the incident was having on viewers around the world. "I've been treated exactly like this," wrote one commenter. "The assumptions, the dismissive attitude, the refusal to listen. Thank you for documenting this." Another viewer added, "My grandmother always dressed simply when she traveled, even though she was successful. People treated her like this constantly." News outlets were requesting permission to use Elena's footage, with CNN, NBC, and ABC all reaching out within minutes of each other. Local news stations in Denver and Miami were asking for interviews, and civil rights organizations were requesting copies of the documentation for potential legal proceedings. The story was developing institutional momentum that would extend far beyond social media engagement. Elena's Twitter notifications were showing hundreds of retweets and replies, with verified accounts from journalists, activists, and politicians beginning to amplify the story. Several verified accounts belonging to airline industry experts were analyzing the incident and questioning United Airways passenger treatment protocols and crew training procedures. The comment section was revealing the broader cultural divisions around issues of race, class, and fairness in customer service. While many viewers expressed outrage at the discrimination they'd witnessed, others defended the airline's right to enforce policies and maintain order. The debate was playing out in real time across multiple platforms, creating exactly the kind of viral controversy that could force institutional change. The most disturbing part, Elena continued her live narration, is how confident the crew members were about their assumptions. They never doubted for a second that they were right to move. Her never questioned whether there might be more to the story. This is what prejudice looks like when it's institutionalized and supported by policy. Her documentation had captured not just the central conflict, but also the reactions of first-class passengers who'd supported the discriminatory treatment. The comments from Dr. Reynolds and Marcus Sullivan, along with their visible satisfaction at the woman's removal, had become key elements of the viral content that illustrated how discrimination operated through community support and social reinforcement. Major news organizations were beginning to publish initial reports based on Elena's social media documentation with headlines like "Passenger Forced from First Class on United Flight" and "Viral Video Shows Alleged Airline Discrimination" appearing on news websites and mobile apps. The story was transitioning from social media phenomenon to mainstream news coverage with remarkable speed. Elena's phone was showing dozens of missed calls and hundreds of text messages from followers, fellow bloggers, and news organizations seeking additional information or requesting interviews. The response was overwhelming, but she continued documenting because she recognized that the story was far from over. "If you're just joining us," Elena said, for new viewers entering her live stream, "we're on United Airways Flight 847, and we just witnessed a woman being forced out of first class based on racial assumptions by crew members. But here's what I'm thinking. Something tells me this story isn't finished. There was something about that woman's composure that suggested she wasn't just another passenger." The live stream had become a shared experience for viewers around the world who were witnessing discrimination in real time and demanding accountability from institutions that were supposed to serve all customers equally. The power of social media documentation was transforming what might have been an invisible injustice into a public reckoning that would demand answers and consequences. In the cockpit of Flight 847, Captain Miguel Hernandez was focused on pre-flight preparations and weather analysis, unaware that a significant passenger incident was developing in the cabin behind him. His attention was devoted to reviewing updated meteorological reports that showed shifting wind patterns and potential turbulence zones along their planned route to Miami. First Officer Brandon Kelly was working through routine equipment checks with his characteristic attention to detail, noting minor variations in instrument readings that probably indicated normal operational fluctuations but deserved monitoring throughout the flight. The delays had compressed their preparation timeline, but both pilots were committed to maintaining their safety standards regardless of schedule pressures. Weather radar is showing some interesting patterns developing over the Appalachians, Hernandez mentioned to Kelly as he reviewed the latest reports. "Nothing that should affect our route significantly, but we'll want to keep an eye on it as conditions develop during the flight." Kelly nodded, making notes on his flight planning documents. "I'm seeing some minor fluctuations in the hydraulic pressure readings. Probably nothing significant, but I'll monitor it during climb and cruise to make sure we're not developing any issues that could affect our control systems." Neither pilot was aware that the passenger seating situation behind them was being documented and broadcast live to a rapidly growing online audience. The cabin crew hadn't felt the need to inform the flight deck about what they considered a routine passenger management issue, and the cockpit's focus on technical preparations meant they were isolated from the social dynamics developing in the passenger cabin. Back in seat 38C, Diane Roberts was listening intently to the changing sounds of the aircraft engines as ground crew completed their final preparations. Her trained ear could detect subtle variations in engine tone and system operations that most passengers would never notice or understand. Years of technical aviation experience had taught her to read aircraft condition through auditory cues that were invisible to civilian travelers. She was also watching the cabin crew's procedures and timing, noting the efficiency and professionalism of their preparations, while mentally contrasting that competence with the assumptions and prejudices they displayed during her forced relocation. The disconnect between technical skill and human understanding was something she'd encountered before in her career, and it always troubled her. Tiffany Brooks and Rachel Morrison were completing their pre-departure duties with satisfaction at having resolved what they considered a challenging passenger situation efficiently and professionally. Both flight attendants felt they'd demonstrated appropriate firmness in maintaining cabin standards and passenger safety, and they expected commendation from supervisors for their handling of the incident. Neither crew member was aware that their actions were being documented and broadcast to a global audience, or that their passenger management decisions were being analyzed by aviation experts, civil rights advocates, and news organizations around the world. The viral documentation was creating accountability pressures that would soon extend far beyond their immediate supervisory structure. Dr. Patricia Reynolds and Marcus Sullivan were settling into their first-class accommodations with renewed appreciation for the exclusivity and standards they'd paid to enjoy. Both passengers felt that the crew's firm response to unauthorized seat occupation demonstrated the professionalism and attention to detail that justified premium pricing for first-class service. Marcus had posted his own video and photos of the incident to his personal social media accounts, presenting the situation as an example of proper policy enforcement and appropriate consequences for passenger misconduct. His content was being shared within his professional network as evidence of the kind of firm boundary maintenance that characterized successful organizations. Neither passenger realized that their comments and reactions were becoming central elements of a viral discrimination incident that was attracting national attention and criticism. The social media content they'd intended as support for airline policy enforcement was being interpreted very differently by audiences who saw their behavior as evidence of ingrained prejudice and social bias. Elena Vasquez continued monitoring the developing situation while maintaining her live-stream documentation. Her audience was asking questions about the woman who'd been moved, noting her unusual composure and the specific way she'd requested consultation with the captain. Several viewers who claimed aviation expertise were suggesting that her behavior indicated knowledge of procedures that went beyond typical passenger understanding. The growing online attention was beginning to attract investigation from journalists and aviation experts who were analyzing the incident for broader implications about airline discrimination and passenger treatment protocols. The story was developing multiple layers that extended far beyond the immediate conflict over seating arrangements. Captain Miguel Hernandez completed his review of weather reports and turned his attention to aircraft systems monitoring, noting several minor variations that probably indicated normal operational fluctuations, but deserved continued observation throughout the flight. His 20 years of commercial aviation experience had taught him that small anomalies could sometimes develop into larger problems, making vigilant monitoring essential for passenger safety. "I'm seeing some interesting patterns in the engine monitoring systems," Hernandez mentioned to First Officer Kelly as he reviewed the latest diagnostic reports. "Probably nothing significant, but the left engine is showing slightly higher operating temperatures than normal. We should keep an eye on that as we move through different phases of flight." Kelly made notes on his monitoring checklist, adding the engine temperature variations to his list of items requiring ongoing attention during the flight. "I noticed that earlier during the systems check. It's still within normal operating parameters, but it's definitely worth watching in case it indicates developing issues with cooling systems or fuel flow." Both pilots were experienced enough to understand that modern aircraft systems were designed with multiple redundancies and safety margins that could accommodate minor system variations without compromising flight safety. However, their training emphasized the importance of early detection and monitoring of any changes that might indicate developing problems requiring intervention. In Seat 38C, Diane Roberts was conducting her own informal assessment of aircraft condition through careful attention to engine sound system operations and the subtle vibrations that indicated normal aircraft function. Her technical background gave her awareness of aviation systems that extended far beyond typical passenger knowledge, and she was noting several details that confirmed her own concerns about the flight conditions ahead. The engine temperature variations that Captain Hernandez had noted were subtle enough that most crew members wouldn't detect them, but Diane's trained ear could hear differences in engine tone that suggested minor inefficiencies in combustion or cooling systems. While not immediately dangerous, these variations could indicate developing problems that might require attention during flight. She was also listening to the sounds of hydraulic systems, electrical systems, and environmental controls, building a mental picture of aircraft condition that drew on decades of technical aviation experience. Her assessment suggested that while the aircraft was safe for flight, there were several minor issues that deserved monitoring and might require crew attention if they developed into larger problems. The weather reports that Hernandez was reviewing showed storm systems moving across their planned route with potential for turbulence and wind shear conditions that could stress aircraft systems and require pilot intervention beyond routine flight operations. The combination of minor technical variations and challenging weather conditions created scenarios that might demand expertise beyond standard commercial aviation procedures. Diane's military aviation background had included extensive training in emergency procedures, crisis management, and coordination between civilian and military aviation systems during complex situations. While she hoped that her experience wouldn't be needed during Flight 847, she was mentally reviewing procedures and protocols that might become relevant if conditions deteriorated beyond normal commercial aviation capabilities. The passenger incident that had forced her relocation from first class was troubling not just for its obvious discrimination, but because it had separated her from the cockpit area where she could provide immediate assistance if technical problems developed into crisis situations. Her presence in Seat 38C reduced her ability to communicate quickly with flight crew if her expertise became necessary for passenger safety. Elena Vasquez's live stream audience was asking questions about the woman's apparent aviation knowledge and her unusual behavior during the seating confrontation. Several viewers who claimed professional aviation experience were noting that her requests to speak with the captain and her calm response to crew commands suggested familiarity with aircraft procedures that went beyond typical passenger understanding. The developing online conversation was beginning to include speculation about the woman's background and qualifications, with some viewers suggesting that the crew might have made assumptions about someone whose expertise could be valuable during flight operations. This speculation was adding another layer to the viral story that extended beyond discrimination into questions about competence, respect, and institutional decision-making under pressure. Flight 847 had been climbing smoothly through 28,000 feet when the first indications of serious trouble appeared with shocking suddenness. The left engine, which had been showing minor temperature variations during pre-flight checks, suddenly exploded in a cascade of metal fragments and burning fuel that sent massive shock waves through the aircraft structure. The Boeing 707 lurched violently to the left as chunks of engine cowling struck the wing and fuselage with tremendous force. Emergency lights bathed the passenger cabin in pulsing red illumination as oxygen masks deployed from overhead compartments throughout the aircraft. The familiar hum of normal flight operations was replaced instantly by the terrifying sounds of mechanical failure and structural stress. Captain Hernandez felt the aircraft shudder under the impact of engine fragments and immediately recognized that this wasn't a minor mechanical problem, but a catastrophic failure requiring immediate emergency response. His hands moved instinctively to flight controls as he fought to maintain aircraft stability and prevent the loss of left engine thrust from sending them into an uncontrollable roll. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Hernandez transmitted over the emergency frequency, his voice tight with professional control despite the severity of the situation. United 847, catastrophic left engine failure, declaring emergency and requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport. We have structural damage and are experiencing control difficulties. In the passenger cabin, chaos erupted instantly as travelers realized that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Screaming and crying filled the air as the aircraft shuddered and bucked like a wounded animal fighting for survival. Passengers struggled with oxygen masks while trying to understand what was happening and whether they would survive the next few minutes. Flight attendant Tiffany Brooks, who moments before had been smugly enforcing seating protocols, now found herself gripping a galley bulkhead for support as she tried to help terrified passengers with emergency procedures. Her training had covered emergency situations, but the violence of the engine failure and the aircraft's unstable flight path were beyond anything she'd experienced or practiced. The first-class cabin, which had been an environment of quiet exclusivity just minutes earlier, was now filled with the same terror and confusion affecting the rest of the aircraft. Dr. Patricia Reynolds was fumbling with her oxygen mask while her husband tried to comfort her. Marcus Sullivan had dropped his smartphone and was gripping his armrests with white knuckles as the aircraft continued its sickening motion. Throughout the passenger cabin, people were praying, crying, and calling loved ones to say goodbye, believing that they were experiencing the final minutes of their lives. The emergency had transformed a routine commercial flight into a life-or-death crisis that would require extraordinary expertise and calm decision-making to survive. In the cockpit, First Officer Kelly was working frantically through emergency checklists while monitoring instrument readings that showed the full extent of their crisis. The explosion had caused more damage than initially apparent, affecting hydraulic systems and flight controls in ways that complicated their ability to maintain stable flight and execute emergency procedures. "We're losing hydraulic pressure in multiple systems," Kelly reported to Hernandez. His voice strained but professional. "I'm seeing indications of structural damage beyond the engine failure. We need to declare a full emergency and get priority handling for immediate landing." But in seat 38C, Diane Roberts remained strangely calm amid the chaos surrounding her. While other passengers panicked and crew members struggled with emergency procedures, she was methodically reviewing mental checklists and calculations that drew on decades of aviation experience, far beyond anything available to commercial airline operations. As passengers throughout the aircraft struggled with terror and confusion, Diane Roberts unbuckled her seatbelt and began moving forward through the chaos with the steady determination of someone who had trained extensively for exactly this type of crisis situation. Her movement through the panicked cabin was purposeful and unhurried, suggesting someone whose response to emergency situations was guided by training rather than instinct. Elena Vasquez, still documenting the flight despite her own fear, captured Diane's movement on her live stream. "The woman who was forced out of first class is moving toward the cockpit," Elena narrated for her audience, her voice tight with stress but still functioning. "While everyone else is panicking, she looks like she knows exactly what she's doing." Flight attendant Rachel Morrison saw Diane approaching and shouted over the noise of screaming passengers and groaning aircraft structure. "Ma'am, return to your seat immediately. This is an emergency situation and all passengers must remain seated with seatbelts fastened." But Diane didn't stop or acknowledge the command. Her focus was entirely directed toward the cockpit area, her expression showing the kind of professional concentration that suggested she was assessing technical details and emergency procedures rather than reacting emotionally to the crisis situation. Tiffany Brooks, struggling to maintain her balance in the unstable aircraft, also tried to intercept Diane's forward movement. "You can't go up there. The flight deck is restricted during emergency operations. Return to your seat immediately or face federal charges." The irony of the situation was lost on neither Diane nor the thousands of viewers watching Elena's live stream. The same crew members who had humiliated and dismissed her just minutes earlier were now trying to prevent her from reaching the area where her expertise might be most valuable for everyone's survival. Diane paused briefly and looked directly at Tiffany with an expression that combined professional assessment with something that might have been pity. "Sometimes," she said calmly, despite the chaos around them, "the people you think don't belong are exactly the people you need most." Her response carried weight that went beyond the immediate crisis, suggesting depths of experience and capability that the crew's assumptions had completely missed. But there was no time for extended conversation or detailed explanations. The aircraft was in immediate danger, and every second of delay reduced their chances of successful emergency response. As Diane continued toward the cockpit, she was mentally reviewing emergency procedures and protocols that extended far beyond standard commercial aviation training. Her background included coordination between civilian and military aviation systems during crisis situations, knowledge of emergency response capabilities that weren't typically available to commercial flights, and expertise in managing complex technical problems under extreme pressure. The engine failure had created multiple cascading problems that would require extraordinary coordination and expertise to resolve successfully. Standard commercial aviation procedures might not be sufficient for the level of system damage and control difficulties that Flight 847 was experiencing, and additional resources and expertise might be necessary for successful emergency response. Elena's live stream audience was growing rapidly as news of the emergency spread across social media platforms. Viewers who had initially tuned in to watch airline discrimination were now witnessing a life-or-death crisis that was testing everyone's assumptions about competence, authority, and the value of expertise that didn't fit conventional expectations. "I don't know who this woman is." Elena continued her narration, but something tells me we're about to find out why she was so calm when they forced her out of first class. Her behavior suggests she knows something about aviation that goes way beyond normal passenger knowledge. Diane Roberts was now approaching the cockpit door, her movement through the emergency-darkened cabin suggesting someone who was entirely comfortable operating in crisis situations and emergency environments. Diane Roberts reached the cockpit door and knocked with a specific pattern that had nothing to do with politeness or passenger protocol. 3 short knocks followed by 2 long ones, then 3 short knocks again. The sequence was precise and deliberate, suggesting a code or signal that carried significance beyond simple request for attention. Inside the cockpit, Captain Hernandez and First Officer Kelly were working frantically through emergency checklists while fighting to maintain aircraft control. The engine explosion had created multiple system failures that were testing their ability to keep the aircraft stable and flyable. Both pilots were drawing on every aspect of their training and experience to manage a crisis that was approaching the limits of standard commercial aviation procedures. When the specific knock pattern reached them through the cockpit door, both pilots paused momentarily despite the urgency of their situation. The sequence was unmistakably military aviation code, a communication protocol used only by personnel with specific security clearances and emergency response authority. Captain Hernandez looked at Kelly with an expression of surprise and confusion. "That's not standard passenger communication," he said, his voice tight with the stress of managing multiple emergency procedures simultaneously. "That's military emergency protocol." How would a passenger know that Sequence Kelly was equally puzzled, but recognized that their current situation was beyond normal commercial aviation capabilities? The engine failure had damaged multiple systems in ways that might require expertise and resources beyond their standard emergency procedures. If there was additional qualified assistance available, they needed to access it immediately. Hernandez made a decision that went against standard cockpit security protocols, but reflected the extraordinary nature of their emergency situation. He opened the cockpit door expecting to find a confused or panicked passenger who had somehow learned an inappropriate communication code. Instead, he found Diane Roberts standing calmly in the doorway, her expression showing professional assessment rather than passenger fear. There was something in her bearing that suggested command experience and technical expertise qualities that didn't match her civilian appearance, but were immediately recognizable to experienced pilots. Captain Hernandez Diane said, her voice carrying authority that hadn't been present during her interactions with the cabin crew. "I'm Admiral Diane Roberts, United States Air Force, retired. I believe you could use some assistance with your current situation." The transformation in Captain Hernandez's expression was immediate and dramatic. Relief flooded his face as he realized that the woman his crew had treated as an unauthorized passenger was actually a senior military aviation officer whose expertise might be exactly what they needed to survive their current crisis. "Thank God," Hernandez breathed, stepping back to allow Diane access to the cockpit. "Admiral, we have catastrophic engine failure with multiple system damage. We're experiencing control difficulties and may be beyond standard commercial emergency procedures." Diane stepped into the cockpit with the same calm competence she'd displayed throughout the passenger cabin incident, but now her expertise was directed toward technical assessment and emergency response rather than enduring discrimination. Her eyes immediately went to instrument readings and system displays, her experience allowing rapid evaluation of their situation and available options. "I'll take command of emergency coordination," Diane said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life or death decisions under pressure. "Captain, continue flying the aircraft." "First Officer, I need a complete status report on all systems and damage assessment." The cockpit had transformed from a space of desperate crisis management to one of coordinated professional response, with Admiral Roberts bringing decades of military aviation experience to bear on problems that had been testing the limits of civilian commercial procedures. Admiral Roberts moved into the cockpit with practiced efficiency, her eyes immediately scanning instrument displays and system readouts to assess the full scope of their emergency situation. Her decades of military aviation experience had included coordination of complex emergency responses that required integration of multiple agencies, resources, and expertise levels far beyond standard commercial aviation procedures. "Captain Hernandez, I need you to maintain current heading and altitude while we assess our options." Admiral Roberts said, her voice carrying calm authority that immediately changed the atmosphere in the cockpit. "First Officer Kelly, give me complete system status, including all secondary and tertiary backup systems." Kelly provided a rapid but thorough briefing on aircraft condition damage assessment and available resources. The engine explosion had caused more extensive damage than initially apparent, affecting hydraulic systems, electrical backup systems, and flight control mechanisms in ways that complicated standard emergency procedures and reduced their safety margins significantly. Admiral Roberts processed the information with the speed and accuracy that came from years of experience managing aviation emergencies under pressure. Her assessment of their situation drew on knowledge of aircraft systems, emergency protocols, and resource coordination capabilities that extended far beyond civilian commercial aviation training and procedures. "We need to coordinate with military emergency response systems," Admiral Roberts said, reaching for the communication controls. "The level of system damage you're experiencing requires resources and expertise beyond standard commercial emergency procedures. I'm going to activate glass corridor protocols." Neither Captain Hernandez nor First Officer Kelly was familiar with glass corridor protocols, but they recognized that Admiral Roberts was accessing resources and procedures that weren't available through normal commercial aviation channels. Her confidence and expertise suggested that their survival chances had improved significantly with her involvement. Admiral Roberts began transmitting on frequencies that weren't normally used by commercial aircraft, identifying herself with call signs and authentication codes that opened communication channels to military emergency response systems. Her communications were crisp and professional, providing technical details about their situation and requesting assistance that went beyond standard air traffic control capabilities. "Glass corridor request authorized." Admiral Roberts came the response from Military Emergency Coordination. "We're establishing priority handling and deploying specialized emergency response assets. Vector information and support resources will be available within 5 minutes." The response confirmed that Admiral Roberts had access to emergency resources that could provide assistance beyond anything available through normal commercial aviation procedures. The glass corridor protocols she'd activated were creating a protected airspace and coordinated response system that integrated military and civilian emergency capabilities for complex crisis situations. "Captain, I need you to prepare for emergency landing procedures that will be different from standard commercial protocols," Admiral Roberts said to Hernandez. "We're going to receive vector guidance and landing assistance from specialized emergency response systems that can accommodate our level of system damage." In the passenger cabin, Elena Vasquez was continuing her live stream documentation despite the ongoing emergency. Her audience had grown to over 200,000 viewers as news of the crisis spread across social media platforms, and people around the world watched the emergency response unfold in real time. "I don't know exactly what's happening up there," Elena narrated for her audience, "but the woman they discriminated against is now in the cockpit and something has changed. The aircraft feels more stable, and there's a sense that someone with serious expertise is now handling the emergency. Her live stream was being monitored by aviation experts and news organizations around the world who were analyzing the emergency response and noting the unusual procedures being employed. The story had evolved far beyond airline discrimination into a demonstration of expertise and emergency coordination that challenged assumptions about competence and authority. Admiral Roberts was now coordinating multiple communication channels, simultaneously managing information flow between the cockpit military emergency response systems and civilian air traffic control to ensure that all available resources were focused on successful emergency response and passenger safety. Admiral Roberts had transformed the cockpit environment from desperate crisis management to coordinated professional emergency response. Her activation of glass corridor protocols had created access to resources and expertise that were providing solutions for problems beyond standard commercial aviation capabilities. The specialized guidance and support systems now available were designed to handle exactly the kind of complex emergency that Flight 847 was experiencing. Approach control. This is Admiral Roberts coordinating emergency response for United 847. She transmitted on the military emergency frequency. We have confirmed structural damage beyond standard parameters and need specialized emergency response protocols for landing configuration and emergency services deployment. The response was immediate and comprehensive. Military emergency coordination was providing vector guidance specifically calculated for their level of system damage, along with emergency services deployment that included specialized equipment and personnel trained for complex aviation emergencies. The level of support being mobilized exceeded anything available through normal commercial emergency procedures. Captain Hernandez was following Admiral Roberts' guidance while maintaining focus on aircraft control and system management. The combination of his commercial aviation expertise and Admiral Roberts' emergency coordination capabilities was creating a response that neither could have achieved independently. Their collaboration was demonstrating the value of integrating different types of expertise during crisis situations. All passengers, this is Admiral Diane Roberts. Speaking from the flight deck came the announcement over the cabin address system. Her voice carried calm authority that immediately changed the atmosphere throughout the aircraft. We are experiencing engine difficulties, but we have the situation under control and are coordinating with emergency response systems for safe landing. The transformation in passenger behavior was immediate and remarkable. The panic and terror that had filled the cabin moments earlier gave way to focused attention and cooperation as passengers recognized that someone with serious expertise was now managing their emergency. Admiral Roberts' calm competence was providing the leadership and reassurance that was essential for passenger safety during emergency procedures. Elena Vasquez captured the change in cabin atmosphere for her live stream audience. "Everything has changed," she narrated. "The panic is gone. People are following emergency procedures, and there's a sense that we're going to survive this. The woman they tried to force out of first class is now saving everyone's lives." In first class, Dr. Patricia Reynolds and Marcus Sullivan were experiencing profound realization about their earlier assumptions and behavior. The woman they'd supported removing from premium seating was now revealed as someone whose expertise was essential for their survival. Their prejudices and assumptions had nearly prevented access to capabilities that were now saving their lives. The emergency landing sequence proceeded with precision that demonstrated the value of Admiral Roberts' coordination and expertise. The specialized guidance systems and emergency response protocols she'd activated were providing solutions for problems that had seemed insurmountable just minutes earlier. Flight 847 touched down at Denver International Airport with emergency services deployed and ready for immediate response. The landing was successful with all 247 passengers and crew safe, despite the catastrophic engine failure and system damage that had threatened their survival. Admiral Roberts' intervention and coordination had transformed what could have been a tragic accident into a demonstration of expertise, professionalism, and emergency response excellence. As the aircraft came to a stop and emergency evacuation procedures began, passengers throughout the cabin realized they owed their lives to the woman who had been discriminated against and dismissed just hours earlier. The contrast between their treatment of her and her response to their crisis would become central to the story that would soon transform airline industry practices and social awareness. As emergency evacuation procedures concluded and passengers gathered in the terminal, Captain Hernandez requested use of the airport's public address system to make an announcement that would transform everyone's understanding of what had occurred during Flight 847. His voice carried across the waiting area where passengers, crew members, and emergency response personnel were processing the events of the past hour. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to personally thank someone whose expertise saved all of our lives today. Captain Hernandez began, his voice carrying emotion that reflected the profound impact of their shared experience. Admiral Diane Roberts, United States Air Force, brought decades of military aviation experience to our emergency response when our situation exceeded standard commercial aviation capabilities. The terminal fell silent as passengers processed the revelation. The woman who had been forced out of first class, humiliated and dismissed by crew members and fellow passengers, was being identified as a senior military officer whose expertise had been essential for their survival. The contrast between her treatment and her qualifications was stunning and undeniable. Admiral Roberts served 25 years in the United States Air Force, including command of air operations in Afghanistan. Captain Hernandez continued, "She is a recipient of the Silver Star for Valor in combat operations and is recognized as one of the nation's leading experts in aviation emergency procedures and crisis coordination." Elena Vasquez, who had documented the entire sequence of events from discrimination through emergency response, was providing live commentary for her audience as the full scope of the story became clear. Her live stream was now showing over 400,000 viewers as news of the emergency and dramatic revelation spread across social media platforms worldwide. Dr. Patricia Reynolds felt a crushing sense of shame as she realized the magnitude of her assumptions and prejudices. The woman she'd dismissed as someone who didn't know her place was actually someone whose service and sacrifice had earned the highest levels of recognition from the United States military. Her comments about entitlement and earning treatment were revealed as profound misunderstanding of merit and achievement. Marcus Sullivan was experiencing similar realization about his role in supporting discrimination against someone whose qualifications and service record exceeded anything in his own professional background. The social media content he'd posted celebrating her removal from first class now appeared as evidence of his own ignorance and prejudice rather than proper boundary enforcement. Admiral Roberts retired from active duty 18 months ago and currently works as a civilian consultant on aviation emergency procedures, Captain Hernandez explained. Her presence on Flight 847 was coincidental, but her expertise became essential when our emergency exceeded the capabilities of standard commercial aviation protocols. The revelation was creating profound impact beyond the immediate passengers and crew. Elena's live stream audience was sharing the content across multiple platforms, creating viral spread that was attracting attention from news organizations, civil rights groups, and government officials who recognized the broader implications of what had occurred. Admiral Roberts herself remained composed and professional throughout the revelation, accepting recognition with the same dignity she'd maintained during the discrimination incident. Her focus remained on ensuring that all passengers had received appropriate medical evaluation and support following the emergency, demonstrating the same commitment to service that had characterized her military career. The contrast between her treatment during boarding and her essential role during the emergency was creating powerful narrative about assumptions, prejudice, and the danger of judging people based on appearance rather than capability. The story was becoming a case study in discrimination and its potential consequences for institutional effectiveness and public safety. News organizations were beginning to request interviews and statements, recognizing that the incident raised significant questions about airline training, passenger treatment, and the broader implications of prejudice in service industries. The story was developing momentum that would extend far beyond social media into policy discussions and institutional reform. As passengers dispersed throughout the terminal and emergency procedures concluded, Admiral Roberts found herself face to face with the crew members who had treated her with such dismissive prejudice just hours earlier. Tiffany Brooks approached with visible trembling, her face pale with the realization of what she had done and who she had treated so poorly. "Admiral, I'm so sorry." Tiffany began, her voice shaking with emotion and fear. "I didn't know who you were. I made terrible assumptions, and I treated you badly when you deserved respect. I don't know how to apologize for what I did." Admiral Roberts looked at Tiffany with the same calm composure she'd maintained throughout both the discrimination incident and the emergency response. Her expression showed neither anger nor satisfaction, but rather the kind of professional assessment that evaluated behavior and its implications without personalizing the conflict. Miss Brooks, Admiral Roberts replied quietly, "You didn't need to know my military rank or background to treat me with basic human dignity. The problem isn't that you didn't recognize my qualifications. The problem is that you made assumptions about my worth based on my appearance and background." Her response carried weight that went far beyond personal criticism to address the broader issues of prejudice and assumption that had shaped the entire incident. Admiral Roberts was addressing not just individual behavior, but the thinking patterns and institutional culture that had supported and enabled discriminatory treatment. Rachel Morrison, the senior flight attendant who had backed Tiffany's discriminatory actions, was experiencing her own profound realization about the implications of her behavior. As head of cabin crew, she bore additional responsibility for the incident and its potential consequences for United Airways' reputation and legal standing. Admiral Roberts: "I want to accept full responsibility for this incident," Rachel said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that her career was effectively over. "As senior crew member, I should have questioned our assumptions and investigated your requests to speak with the captain. My failure of judgment put passengers at risk and created a situation that was both morally wrong and potentially dangerous." The acknowledgement of danger was particularly significant because Admiral Roberts's forced removal from first class had separated her from the cockpit area where she could have provided immediate assistance when the emergency developed. The crew's discriminatory actions had potentially compromised passenger safety by limiting access to expertise that proved essential for survival. Elena Vasquez continued documenting the confrontation for her live stream audience, recognizing that these moments of accountability were as important as the initial discrimination for understanding the broader implications of the incident. Her audience was witnessing not just discrimination but its consequences and the process of institutional accountability. What you're seeing here, Elena narrated for her viewers, is what accountability looks like when assumptions and prejudice meet reality. These crew members are realizing that their discrimination wasn't just morally wrong but potentially dangerous for everyone on the aircraft. Other crew members who had witnessed the discrimination without intervening were also grappling with their own roles in the incident. Their silence and passive support for discriminatory actions had contributed to an environment where prejudice was acceptable and unchallenged, creating institutional responsibility that extended beyond the primary actors. Admiral Roberts's response to the crew's apologies was measured and professional, reflecting her military training in leadership and accountability. She wasn't interested in personal revenge or individual punishment, but rather in ensuring that the lessons learned from the incident would prevent similar situations in the future. The most important thing now, Admiral Roberts told the assembled crew members, is that this incident becomes a learning opportunity that prevents other passengers from experiencing similar treatment. Your assumptions about me were wrong, but more importantly, the thinking that created those assumptions is wrong regardless of who the target might be. Elena Vasquez's documentation of the complete incident from initial discrimination through emergency response and revelation had created viral content that was transforming public conversation about airline discrimination and institutional prejudice. Her live stream had reached over 600,000 concurrent viewers, with the recorded content being shared across multiple platforms at unprecedented rates. The hashtag Admiral Roberts had joined hashtag United Shame as trending topics worldwide, with millions of social media users sharing the content and adding their own commentary about discrimination assumptions and the danger of judging people based on appearance. The story was resonating with audiences who had experienced similar treatment and recognized the broader implications of institutional prejudice. Major news organizations were providing comprehensive coverage of the incident, with CNN, NBC, ABC, and Fox News all featuring the story as breaking news. International media outlets were also covering the incident, recognizing its significance for discussions about discrimination service industry training and the treatment of military veterans in civilian environments. Social media analysis was showing engagement levels that exceeded typical viral content, with the story generating discussion across demographic groups, political affiliations, and international boundaries. The combination of clear discrimination, dramatic emergency response, and powerful revelation had created narrative elements that appealed to universal human values of fairness, competence, and justice. Civil rights organizations were using the incident as an example of how discrimination operated in everyday situations, and the importance of challenging assumptions about people based on appearance or background. Military veteran groups were expressing outrage at the treatment Admiral Roberts had received and demanding accountability from United Airways for discriminating against someone who had served her country with distinction. Comments on Elena's social media posts revealed the deep personal impact the incident was having on viewers around the world. "I've been treated exactly like this," wrote one commenter. The assumptions, the dismissive attitude, the refusal to listen. Seeing Admiral Roberts maintain her dignity through this treatment and then save everyone's lives is incredibly powerful. Aviation industry experts were analyzing the incident for its implications regarding crew training emergency procedures and the value of recognizing expertise that might not fit conventional expectations. Several were noting that Admiral Roberts' military background and aviation expertise represented exactly the kind of additional resources that could be essential during complex emergencies. The viral spread was creating pressure for institutional response beyond United Airways to include broader airline industry examination of training procedures, passenger treatment protocols, and discrimination prevention measures. Government officials were beginning to make statements about the incident and its implications for civil rights enforcement and service industry accountability. Elena's role as documenter had evolved from travel blogger to citizen journalist, covering a story with national significance. Her decision to record and broadcast the incident had created accountability that would force institutional change and prevent similar incidents from occurring without consequences. The power of social media documentation was demonstrated through the real-time transformation of an invisible injustice into a public reckoning that would demand answers, accountability, and reform from institutions that were supposed to serve all customers equally and professionally. Throughout the terminal, passengers from Flight 847 were processing the revelation of Admiral Roberts' identity and service record with varying degrees of shame, amazement, and profound reconsideration of their own assumptions and behavior. The dramatic contrast between her treatment during boarding and her essential role during the emergency was creating powerful personal reckonings for everyone who had witnessed or participated in her discrimination. Dr. Patricia Reynolds was experiencing crushing realization about the implications of her comments and assumptions. As a medical professional who prided herself on competence and scientific objectivity, she was confronting the reality that her prejudices had led her to support discrimination against someone whose qualifications and service record far exceeded anything in her own professional background. "I am ashamed of my behavior and my assumptions," Dr. Reynolds said in a statement she provided to Elena for her social media documentation. "Admiral Roberts served our country with distinction and saved our lives today, while I supported treating her badly because she didn't fit my narrow expectations of what a first-class passenger should look like." Marcus Sullivan was grappling with similar realization about his role in supporting and documenting the discrimination. His social media posts celebrating Admiral Roberts' removal from first class had been shared widely as evidence of the prejudice and assumptions that had shaped passenger reactions to the incident. I deleted my earlier posts about this incident because I realized they showed my own ignorance and prejudice, Sullivan said. I thought I was supporting proper standards, but I was actually supporting discrimination against an American hero who deserved respect, not judgment based on her appearance. Elena Vasquez was documenting these passenger reactions as part of the broader story about accountability and learning from discriminatory behavior. Her audience was witnessing not just the initial discrimination, but also the process of recognition and responsibility that followed revelation of the truth. Other passengers were expressing amazement at Admiral Roberts' composure throughout both the discrimination and emergency response. Many noted that her dignity under pressure had provided a model of professionalism and service that challenged their own assumptions about how people should respond to unfair treatment. She maintained perfect composure when we treated her badly, and then she saved our lives without any sense of revenge or bitterness, said one passenger who had initially supported her removal from first class. Her response to discrimination showed the kind of character that explains why she was successful in military service. The revelation was also creating broader conversations among passengers about their own experiences with discrimination and assumptions based on appearance. Many were sharing stories of being judged unfairly and recognizing the connection between personal experience and the broader social issues illustrated by Admiral Roberts' treatment. Children who had been on the flight were asking their parents to explain what had happened and why the woman had been treated badly. These conversations were creating educational opportunities about fairness, prejudice, and the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their appearance or background. The passenger reactions were becoming part of the broader social media narrative about the incident, with many people sharing their own stories of discrimination and expressing support for Admiral Roberts' dignity and professionalism throughout the experience. The incident was resonating as a powerful example of grace under pressure and the danger of making assumptions about people based on superficial characteristics. Within 2 hours of Flight 847's emergency landing, a crisis management team from United Airways corporate headquarters had arrived at Denver International Airport to assess the situation and coordinate damage control efforts. The team included senior executives, legal counsel, public relations specialists, and human resources personnel who specialized in handling incidents with significant liability and reputation implications. The viral social media coverage had already created a public relations nightmare that extended far beyond typical airline customer service issues. Elena Vasquez's documentation of the incident had been viewed millions of times across multiple platforms, with major news organizations providing continuous coverage of what was being described as one of the most dramatic examples of airline discrimination ever recorded. Corporate executives were reviewing the social media evidence with growing recognition that this incident represented an existential threat to United Airways' reputation and business operations. The combination of clear racial discrimination, dismissive treatment of a military veteran, and the dramatic revelation of Admiral Roberts' essential role in emergency response had created a narrative that challenged the airline's fundamental competence and values. Legal counsel was analyzing potential liability exposure, recognizing that Admiral Roberts' treatment could result in significant federal civil rights violations, discrimination lawsuits, and possible Department of Transportation enforcement actions. The fact that the discrimination had potentially compromised passenger safety by separating Admiral Roberts from the cockpit area added additional layers of legal risk. We need to understand that this incident has created multiple levels of legal and reputation exposure, the lead corporate attorney explained to the crisis team. We have clear evidence of racial discrimination, mistreatment of a military veteran, and crew decisions that potentially compromised passenger safety during an emergency situation. Public relations specialists were monitoring social media trends and news coverage, reporting that the incident was generating negative commentary about United Airways across all demographic groups and market segments. The story was resonating beyond typical civil rights constituencies to include military veteran groups, aviation professionals, and general public audiences who were responding to the universal themes of fairness and competence. Human resources personnel were reviewing crew training records, employment histories, and previous incident reports for the employees involved in the discrimination. Their investigation was revealing patterns of passenger complaints and behavioral issues that suggested the incident wasn't an isolated occurrence, but rather part of broader problems with crew training and supervision. The crisis team was also coordinating with federal authorities who were beginning their own investigation into potential civil rights violations and aviation safety issues related to the incident. The Department of Transportation and Federal Aviation Administration were both expressing concern about crew decision-making and its potential impact on emergency response capabilities. Airport security was providing crowd control as news media organizations, civil rights advocates, and curious members of the public gathered to observe the corporate response and seek statements from Admiral Roberts and other passengers. The incident had attracted national attention that required careful management to prevent additional public relations complications. The magnitude of the crisis was becoming clear to corporate leadership as they reviewed the evidence and assessed the potential consequences. This wasn't a situation that could be resolved through routine customer service recovery or standard public relations responses. The incident required fundamental examination of airline policies, training procedures, and corporate culture. The United Airways Crisis Management Team had completed their investigation and review of the incident within 6 hours of the emergency landing. The evidence from Elena Vasquez's social media documentation, passenger statements, and crew member interviews had created an unambiguous record of discriminatory behavior that violated federal civil rights laws, airline policies, and basic professional standards. Corporate executives had made the decision that immediate termination of the crew members involved in the discrimination was necessary to demonstrate accountability and prevent additional legal and reputation exposure. The termination meeting was scheduled to take place in the airport's conference facilities, with Admiral Roberts invited to attend if she chose to do so. Tiffany Brooks and Rachel Morrison were called to meet with senior human resources personnel and corporate executives, along with their union representatives and legal counsel. The atmosphere in the conference room was tense, as everyone understood that careers were ending and significant legal consequences were likely to follow. Miss Brooks and Miss Morrison began the senior HR executive. Our investigation has confirmed that your treatment of Admiral Roberts violated federal civil rights laws, United Airways policies, and professional standards that are fundamental to airline operations. Your behavior created legal liability for the company and potentially compromised passenger safety during emergency operations. Elena Vasquez was permitted to document the termination proceedings, recognizing that public accountability was essential for demonstrating that the airline was taking appropriate action. Her live stream audience was witnessing corporate accountability in real time, something that was unusual in situations involving discrimination and employee misconduct. Admiral Roberts attended the meeting and provided a statement that focused on institutional issues rather than individual punishment. Her approach reflected military leadership training that emphasized learning and institutional improvement rather than personal revenge or individual accountability without broader change. This incident reveals problems that extend beyond individual behavior to training supervision and institutional culture. Admiral Roberts said to the assembled corporate executives, "Individual terminations are appropriate, but they won't prevent similar incidents unless they're accompanied by comprehensive examination of policies, training, and accountability practices." Tiffany Brooks was visibly emotional as she faced the consequences of her discriminatory behavior. "I know I made terrible mistakes, and I accept responsibility for my actions," she said. But I want people to understand that I was following training and cultural expectations that supported making assumptions about passengers based on their appearance. Her statement revealed important information about airline training and cultural practices that contributed to discriminatory behavior. The corporate team recognized that Tiffany's claims about training and expectations would require investigation and potential policy changes to prevent similar incidents. Rachel Morrison, as senior crew member, faced additional accountability for her role in supporting and escalating the discrimination. I failed in my leadership responsibility and created a situation where discrimination was not only tolerated but actively supported, she acknowledged. My decisions potentially compromised passenger safety and violated the trust that travelers place in airline professionalism. The termination proceedings concluded with both crew members being escorted from the airport by security personnel, their airline credentials revoked, and their employment with United Airways terminated immediately. The company also announced that they would cooperate fully with federal investigations and civil rights enforcement actions. Elena's documentation of the termination proceedings was creating additional viral content that demonstrated corporate accountability and consequences for discriminatory behavior. Her audience was witnessing justice in real time, something that was often absent in cases of discrimination and prejudice. The terminations represented immediate justice, but Admiral Roberts's comments about broader institutional issues had identified the need for institutional changes that would extend far beyond individual accountability to comprehensive reform of airline training policies and culture. Admiral Diane Roberts agreed to provide a public statement about the incident, recognizing that her voice would carry significant weight in shaping public understanding of the discrimination and its broader implications for airline industry practices and social justice. Her statement was scheduled as a press conference at the airport, with major news organizations and social media representatives in attendance. Elena Vasquez positioned herself prominently to document Admiral Roberts's statement for her ongoing live stream coverage. Her audience had grown to over 800,000 viewers as news of the press conference spread across social media platforms, and people around the world tuned in to hear directly from the woman whose dignity and expertise had been so dramatically demonstrated. I want to begin by thanking Captain Hernandez, First Officer Kelly, and the emergency response personnel who worked together to ensure the safety of all passengers and crew during today's crisis. Admiral Roberts began. Her statement focused immediately on professional cooperation and shared responsibility rather than personal recognition or grievance about her treatment. The discrimination I experienced today was wrong, but it wasn't unique or unusual, Admiral Roberts continued. What made this incident significant was that it was documented and witnessed by people who were willing to speak truth about what they saw. Most discrimination happens without cameras or social media coverage affecting people who don't have military rank or public platforms to demand accountability. Her statement was acknowledging the broader context of discrimination while recognizing the specific circumstances that had made her experience visible and actionable. Admiral Roberts was using her platform to advocate for people whose similar experiences didn't receive attention or accountability. This incident isn't about me, Admiral Roberts said firmly. It's about the assumptions and prejudices that shape how institutions treat people based on appearance, background, and preconceived notions about who belongs in certain spaces. The crew members who discriminated against me aren't uniquely bad people. They were following thinking patterns and cultural expectations that exist throughout our society. The statement was notable for its focus on institutional rather than individual accountability. Admiral Roberts was using her military leadership background to address root causes rather than symptoms, recognizing that lasting change required examination of policies, training, and culture rather than simply punishing individuals. Military service taught me that effective organizations succeed by utilizing all available expertise and treating all personnel with respect, regardless of their background or appearance, Admiral Roberts explained. The same principles apply to civilian institutions that serve diverse populations, and need to access expertise that might not fit conventional expectations. News reporters were asking questions about her plans for legal action and her expectations for airline industry reform. Admiral Roberts's responses were measured and focused on prevention rather than punishment, consistent with her approach throughout the incident. "My goal isn't revenge or financial compensation," Admiral Roberts said in response to questions about lawsuits. "My goal is ensuring that other travelers don't experience similar discrimination and that institutions learn to recognize and value expertise regardless of how it's packaged." Her statement concluded with a challenge to viewers and institutions to examine their own assumptions and practices. Everyone who witnessed this incident, whether in person or through social media, has an opportunity to consider how their own thinking and behavior might contribute to discrimination or justice. That's where real change happens. The press conference was generating additional viral content that extended Admiral Roberts' message far beyond the immediate incident to broader conversations about prejudice, competence, and institutional accountability in service industries and society generally. The viral documentation of Flight 847's discrimination incident had included clear evidence of passenger support for the crew's prejudiced treatment of Admiral Roberts. Dr. Patricia Reynolds and Marcus Sullivan, along with other first-class passengers who had made discriminatory comments, were facing public accountability through social media exposure and professional consequences that extended beyond the immediate flight experience. Dr. Patricia Reynolds' medical practice was receiving calls and messages from patients and colleagues who had seen her discriminatory comments in Elena Vasquez's social media documentation. The medical community's response was particularly strong because healthcare professionals are held to high ethical standards regarding equal treatment and respect for all individuals, regardless of background. Dr. Reynolds' comments about people knowing their place are completely inconsistent with medical ethics and professional conduct, said a statement from the Colorado Medical Association. Healthcare providers must demonstrate respect for all individuals and cannot support discriminatory treatment based on appearance or assumptions about social status. Dr. Reynolds issued her own public apology, recognizing that her professional reputation and practice were at serious risk. "I am ashamed of my comments and behavior during the flight. My assumptions about Admiral Roberts were wrong and offensive, and they violated the ethical principles that should guide my professional and personal conduct." Marcus Sullivan was facing similar accountability through his corporate board and professional network. His social media posts celebrating Admiral Roberts's removal from first class had been widely shared as examples of workplace discrimination and prejudiced thinking that violated corporate diversity and inclusion policies. Mr. Sullivan's public support for discrimination against a military veteran is completely inconsistent with our company's values and professional standards, said a statement from his consulting firm's board of directors. "We are reviewing his status with the company and considering appropriate disciplinary action." Other passengers who had supported or remained silent during the discrimination were also grappling with public exposure and personal accountability. Elena's documentation had captured their faces and reactions, creating lasting evidence of their response to discrimination that would affect their reputations and relationships. The accountability was extending beyond individual consequences to broader conversations about bystander responsibility and complicity in discriminatory situations. Social media discussions were focusing on the obligation to speak up when witnessing discrimination and the moral implications of silent support for prejudiced behavior. Elena Vasquez was documenting these accountability measures as part of her ongoing coverage of the incident's broader implications. Her audience was witnessing how discrimination affected not just victims, but also perpetrators and bystanders who supported or enabled prejudiced treatment. "What we're seeing is accountability in action," Elena explained to her audience. "People who supported discrimination are facing real consequences for their behavior, and institutions are being forced to examine their values and standards. This is how social change happens." The passenger accountability was creating additional pressure for airline industry reform by demonstrating that discriminatory behavior would face consequences beyond immediate crew termination. Passengers who supported or participated in discrimination were learning that their actions had lasting implications for their professional and personal reputations. Civil rights advocates were using the incident to illustrate how discrimination operated through community support and institutional complicity. The passenger accountability was demonstrating that challenging prejudice required confronting not just individual perpetrators, but also the social and cultural practices that supported and enabled discriminatory behavior. Within 48 hours of the Flight 847 incident, United Airways CEO announced a comprehensive policy overhaul designed to address the discrimination issues revealed by Admiral Roberts' treatment and prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. The announcement was made at a press conference that attracted national media attention and civil rights organization participation. The treatment that Admiral Roberts experienced on Flight 847 was completely unacceptable and violated everything United Airways claims to stand for the CEO began. This incident has revealed problems in our training culture and accountability practices that require immediate and comprehensive response. The policy changes announced were substantial and demonstrated recognition that the incident represented broader institutional problems rather than isolated individual misconduct. The reforms addressed training, hiring, supervision, and accountability in ways that would transform airline operations and passenger treatment protocols. Effective immediately, United Airways is implementing mandatory bias awareness training for all customer-facing employees, the CEO announced. This training will be conducted quarterly and will include specific instruction on recognizing and challenging assumptions based on passenger appearance, background, or demographic characteristics. The training overhaul would be developed in consultation with civil rights organizations, military veteran groups, and diversity experts to ensure that it addressed real-world discrimination patterns and provided practical tools for preventing prejudiced behavior. The training would also include accountability measures and performance evaluation criteria related to respectful treatment of all passengers. We are also implementing new passenger feedback and complaint procedures that will provide multiple channels for reporting discriminatory treatment. The CEO continued. These procedures will include independent oversight and investigation procedures that ensure accountability for crew members who violate company policies or federal civil rights laws. The passenger feedback procedures would include anonymous reporting options, third-party investigation procedures, and regular auditing of passenger treatment patterns to identify potential discrimination before it escalated to viral incidents. The procedures would also provide transparency and public accountability for airline responses to discrimination complaints. Admiral Roberts had been invited to serve as a consultant on the policy development and implementation process, bringing her military leadership experience and personal understanding of discrimination to bear on institutional reform efforts. Her involvement demonstrated United Airways' commitment to learning from the incident rather than simply managing public relations consequences. Admiral Roberts has agreed to work with our policy development team to ensure that these reforms address the real issues that contributed to her treatment, the CEO announced. Her expertise in leadership, emergency response, and institutional accountability will be invaluable for creating lasting change. The corporate overhaul also included financial commitments to civil rights organizations and military veteran support groups as part of broader accountability for institutional discrimination. These commitments demonstrated recognition that the incident had implications beyond United Airways to broader social justice and veteran treatment issues. News media analysis was generally positive about the scope and specificity of the announced reforms, though civil rights advocates emphasized the importance of implementation and ongoing accountability rather than policy announcements. The real test of United Airways' commitment would be demonstrated through sustained behavior change and measurable improvements in passenger treatment. The corporate response was being monitored by other airlines and service industry organizations, who recognized that the Flight 847 incident had created new expectations for institutional accountability and discrimination prevention that would affect their own policies and practices. The viral impact of Admiral Roberts's treatment on Flight 847 had created pressure for change that extended far beyond United Airways to affect airline industry practices nationwide. Other major carriers recognized that public tolerance for discriminatory treatment had shifted dramatically, requiring proactive policy changes to prevent similar incidents and maintain customer confidence. American Airlines announced new passenger treatment protocols within a week of the United Airways incident, including mandatory diversity training for all customer-facing employees and revised passenger service policies that emphasized respect and professional treatment regardless of passenger appearance or background. The airline's CEO specifically referenced the Flight 847 incident as motivation for comprehensive policy review. Delta Airlines implemented similar changes focusing particularly on crew training regarding passenger expertise and the importance of recognizing that passengers might have professional qualifications or emergency capabilities that weren't apparent from their appearance. The airline developed new protocols for identifying and utilizing passenger expertise during emergency situations. Southwest Airlines, known for informal culture and customer service, announced enhanced sensitivity training that addressed the intersection of casual corporate culture with professional respect for diverse passengers. The airline recognized that informal approaches to customer service could inadvertently enable discriminatory assumptions and behavior. The Federal Aviation Administration began reviewing industry-wide training standards and passenger treatment protocols, recognizing that discriminatory crew behavior could potentially compromise aviation safety by limiting access to passenger expertise during emergency situations. The agency's review focused on emergency response procedures and crew decision-making during crisis situations. The Department of Transportation initiated a comprehensive examination of airline discrimination complaints and enforcement procedures, using the Flight 847 incident as a case study for improving federal oversight of passenger civil rights. The department's review included analysis of complaint patterns and airline response procedures. Aviation industry trade organizations developed new professional standards and best practices for passenger treatment, emphasizing the importance of respectful service and the potential safety implications of discriminatory behavior. These standards were designed to provide industry-wide guidelines that prevented competitive pressure from undermining civil rights compliance. Flight attendant training programs at airlines nationwide began incorporating specific instruction about unconscious bias, assumption-based decision-making, and the importance of treating all passengers with professional respect. The training included case studies based on the Flight 847 incident and its implications for aviation safety and customer service. Airport authorities also implemented new oversight procedures for monitoring airline passenger treatment, recognizing that discrimination incidents could affect airport reputation and operations. These procedures included passenger feedback procedures and regular auditing of airline customer service practices. The industry changes represented recognition that discrimination wasn't just a moral or legal issue, but also a business and safety concern that could affect operational effectiveness and public confidence in aviation safety. The Flight 847 incident had demonstrated how prejudice could potentially compromise emergency response capabilities and passenger safety. Military veteran organizations worked with airlines to develop recognition programs and training that would help crew members understand and respect the service records and potential expertise of veteran passengers. These programs emphasize the value of military experience and the importance of appropriate recognition for service members. The broader changes reflected recognition that the Flight 847 incident had revealed industry-wide problems rather than isolated issues at a single airline. The comprehensive response demonstrated institutional learning and commitment to preventing similar incidents through proactive policy development and culture change. Elena Vasquez's documentation of the Flight 847 incident had transformed her career from travel blogger to recognized civil rights journalist and advocate. Her thorough real-time coverage of discrimination and its consequences had demonstrated the power of citizen journalism in creating accountability for institutional prejudice and promoting social justice. Major news organizations offered Elena full-time positions based on her Flight 847 coverage, recognizing her ability to document complex social issues with clarity, fairness, and impact. She accepted a position as civil rights correspondent for a national news network, using her platform to continue investigating discrimination in travel hospitality and service industries. Admiral Roberts showed me what courage and dignity look like under pressure, Elena said in interviews about her career transition. Her example inspired me to use my platform and skills to document injustice and hold institutions accountable for their treatment of all people, regardless of appearance or background. Dr. Patricia Reynolds underwent a profound personal transformation following her recognition of her discriminatory behavior and assumptions. She began speaking at medical conferences about unconscious bias in healthcare, using her experience on Flight 847 to illustrate how prejudice could affect professional judgment and patient treatment. My comments on that flight revealed thinking patterns that I didn't even recognize in myself, Dr. Reynolds explained in her presentations. If I could make those assumptions about Admiral Roberts based on her appearance, then I needed to examine how similar prejudices might be affecting my medical practice and patient relationships. Her transformation included additional training in cultural competency and bias recognition, along with implementation of new patient treatment protocols in her practice that emphasized respect and professional service for all patients, regardless of their background or appearance. Marcus Sullivan lost his position on his consulting firm's board of directors, but used the experience as motivation for broader examination of his assumptions and behavior in professional settings. He established a scholarship program for minority students pursuing aviation careers, specifically honoring Admiral Roberts' service and expertise. I realized that my support for discriminating against Admiral Roberts revealed problems in my thinking that probably affected my business relationships and decision-making, Sullivan said. The scholarship program is one way to demonstrate that I've learned from my mistakes and want to support the kind of excellence that Admiral Roberts represents. Captain Miguel Hernandez and First Officer Brandon Kelly both pursued additional training in emergency response procedures and crew resource management, recognizing that their experience with Admiral Roberts had revealed the value of accessing all available expertise during crisis situations. The pilots became advocates within the aviation industry for training that emphasized recognition and utilization of passenger expertise during emergencies. Their experience demonstrated how assumptions and discrimination could potentially compromise flight safety by limiting access to critical capabilities. Former crew members Tiffany Brooks and Rachel Morrison faced significant challenges in rebuilding their careers following termination for discriminatory behavior. Both participated in extensive bias training and community service as part of efforts to demonstrate learning and accountability for their actions. Their experiences became case studies in airline industry training programs illustrating the professional and personal consequences of discriminatory behavior and the importance of treating all passengers with respect and dignity. The personal transformations demonstrated how the Flight 847 incident had affected not just immediate participants, but also broader communities of people who recognized connections between the documented discrimination and their own assumptions, behavior, and professional practices. Admiral Diane Roberts' experience on Flight 847 had revealed the continuing challenges facing military veterans in civilian environments and the importance of bridging military and civilian communities through education advocacy and institutional reform. Her response to discrimination and her essential role in emergency response had created a platform for broader service that honored her military background while addressing contemporary social justice issues. She accepted consulting positions with multiple airlines and aviation organizations, bringing her military expertise to bear on improving emergency response procedures, crew training, and institutional culture. Her work focused on helping civilian aviation organizations understand and utilize the expertise that veterans brought to their customer base and workforce. Military service provides training and experience that can be valuable in civilian emergencies and crisis situations, Admiral Roberts explained in speaking engagements about her post-incident consulting work. But those capabilities are only useful if civilian institutions recognize, respect, and know how to access them. Her consulting work included development of protocols for identifying and utilizing passenger expertise during emergencies training programs that helped crew members recognize and work with passengers who had relevant professional backgrounds, and policy development that prevented discrimination from limiting access to critical capabilities. Admiral Roberts also began speaking regularly at corporate diversity and inclusion events, using her Flight 847 experience to illustrate how assumptions and prejudice could affect organizational effectiveness beyond moral and legal considerations. Her presentations emphasized the business case for respectful treatment of all people and recognition of diverse forms of expertise. The crew members who discriminated against me weren't malicious people, Admiral Roberts would tell corporate audiences. They were following thinking patterns that exist throughout our society and that can limit organizational access to the full range of human capabilities and perspectives available to them. Her speaking engagements attracted audiences from multiple industries who recognized the broader applications of lessons learned from the Flight 847 incident. Her military leadership background and civilian discrimination experience provided unique perspective on institutional change and accountability. Admiral Roberts established partnerships with civil rights organizations and veteran advocacy groups to develop comprehensive approaches to discrimination prevention that addressed both legal compliance and cultural change. Her work emphasized practical strategies for creating inclusive environments that respected diverse backgrounds and experiences. She also worked with military transition programs to help service members prepare for civilian environments where their expertise might not be immediately recognized or valued. Her programs focused on communication strategies, expectation management, and advocacy skills that could help veterans navigate civilian institutions effectively. The Admiral's new mission represented expansion of her service commitment from military to civilian contexts, using her expertise and platform to address discrimination and promote institutional change that would benefit all people who faced assumptions and prejudice based on their appearance or background. Her work demonstrated how personal experiences of discrimination could be transformed into broader advocacy and institutional reform that created positive change extending far beyond individual accountability or recognition. 2 years after the Flight 847 incident, Admiral Diane Roberts returned to Denver International Airport to participate in a commemoration event that honored the anniversary of her emergency response and celebrated the institutional changes that had followed her experience with discrimination and heroism. The event provided opportunity for reflection on personal and institutional transformation. Elena Vasquez, now a nationally recognized civil rights journalist, was documenting the anniversary event for her continuing coverage of discrimination and accountability in service industries. Her relationship with Admiral Roberts had evolved from documenter to friend and professional colleague in advocacy work. Admiral Roberts taught me that dignity under pressure isn't just a personal virtue, Elena reflected during her anniversary coverage. It's a form of leadership that can inspire institutional change and social progress. Her response to discrimination showed the rest of us how to transform injustice into opportunity for broader improvement. Captain Miguel Hernandez and First Officer Brandon Kelly attended the commemoration to express their continuing gratitude for Admiral Roberts's emergency expertise and to acknowledge how her experience had influenced their own professional development and advocacy for respectful passenger treatment. Admiral Roberts saved our lives that night, Captain Hernandez said during the event. But she also taught our industry important lessons about recognizing and respecting the expertise that exists in our passenger cabins. Those lessons have made aviation safer and more professional for everyone. Dr. Patricia Reynolds and Marcus Sullivan both participated in the event using their attendance to demonstrate continuing accountability for their discriminatory behavior and ongoing commitment to institutional change and personal growth. Their participation illustrated how acknowledgement of wrongdoing could lead to positive transformation. Admiral Roberts' grace in responding to our prejudiced treatment showed us a better way to think about people and relationships, Dr. Reynolds said. Her example continues to influence how I practice medicine and how I treat all people in my personal and professional life. The commemoration included announcement of a scholarship program established in Admiral Roberts' honor, providing educational support for military veterans pursuing careers in aviation and transportation. The scholarship represented institutional recognition of veteran expertise and commitment to preventing discriminatory treatment. United Airways CEO presented Admiral Roberts with a Lifetime Achievement Award for her service to aviation safety and civil rights, acknowledging that her experience had catalyzed industry-wide improvements in passenger treatment and emergency response procedures. Admiral Roberts transformed a terrible experience into an opportunity for institutional learning and social progress, the CEO said. Her dignity, expertise, and commitment to justice have made aviation safer and more respectful for everyone. Admiral Roberts' acceptance speech focused on collective responsibility for creating just institutions and respectful communities. Change doesn't happen because of individual heroes, she said. It happens because ordinary people choose to treat each other with dignity and to challenge assumptions that limit human potential. The emotional resolution of the Flight 847 incident demonstrated how personal experiences of discrimination could be transformed into broader social progress through sustained commitment to institutional accountability and cultural change. Admiral Roberts' legacy extended far beyond her individual experience to encompass improved policies, training, and attitudes that would benefit countless future travelers. The Flight 847 incident had created measurable changes in airline industry practices, federal oversight procedures, and public awareness of discrimination in service industries that extended far beyond the immediate participants to affect millions of travelers and thousands of industry professionals. Statistical analysis 2 years after the incident demonstrated significant improvements in passenger treatment and complaint resolution. Federal data showed a 60% reduction in airline discrimination complaints following implementation of industry-wide training and policy reforms inspired by Admiral Roberts' experience. The improvement reflected both better treatment of passengers and increased confidence in complaint and accountability procedures that encouraged reporting and resolution of discriminatory behavior. United Airways reported customer satisfaction improvements that exceeded industry averages, with particular gains in ratings related to respectful treatment and professional service. The airline's investment in comprehensive bias training and accountability procedures had created competitive advantages that demonstrated the business value of civil rights compliance and inclusive culture. Other airlines reported similar improvements following implementation of reforms based on Flight 847 lessons learned. The industry-wide changes had created new standards for passenger treatment that elevated professional expectations and reduced tolerance for discriminatory behavior. Military veteran organizations documented improved treatment of service members in civilian travel environments, with specific recognition of the role that Admiral Roberts' advocacy and education efforts had played in creating awareness of veteran expertise and service contributions. Civil rights organizations used the Flight 847 incident as a model for effective advocacy and institutional accountability, demonstrating how documented evidence of discrimination could be transformed into policy changes and cultural reform. The incident became a case study in successful civil rights enforcement and social justice advocacy. Aviation safety experts noted improvements in emergency response procedures and crew resource management that had resulted from increased awareness of passenger expertise and the importance of accessing all available capabilities during crisis situations. Admiral Roberts' emergency response had illustrated the safety value of respectful treatment and inclusive decision-making. Elena Vasquez's role in documenting the incident had inspired broader use of social media and citizen journalism in civil rights advocacy, creating new models for accountability and institutional pressure. Her work demonstrated how individual documentation could create viral awareness that forced institutional change. The incident's impact on public consciousness was demonstrated through continued social media engagement, educational use in diversity training programs, and citation in academic research on discrimination and institutional accountability. Admiral Roberts's story had become part of broader cultural conversation about fairness, respect, and human dignity. Educational institutions incorporated the Flight 847 incident into curricula addressing civil rights, business ethics, and leadership development. Admiral Roberts's response to discrimination provided a model of dignified resistance and constructive advocacy that inspired students and professionals across multiple disciplines. The lasting legacy of the incident was measured not just in policy changes and statistical improvements, but in transformed understanding of how discrimination operated and how individual and institutional responses could create broader social progress. Admiral Roberts had demonstrated that quiet dignity and persistent advocacy could achieve more lasting change than anger or revenge. If this story moved you, here's what I need you to do right now. Hit that like button to show that dignity and respect matter. Subscribe to this channel because we're committed to sharing stories that challenge assumptions and inspire change. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because Admiral Roberts's message about treating people with respect regardless of how they look is something the world needs to remember. Drop a comment and tell me about a time when you were judged by your appearance, or when you realized you'd made unfair assumptions about someone. Your stories matter, and they help all of us learn and grow. And remember what Admiral Roberts taught us: heroes don't always wear uniforms, but they always choose to do what's right when it matters most. Sometimes the person you think doesn't belong is exactly the person you need. Let's make sure we never forget that lesson. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story where we continue exploring what happens when courage meets injustice and dignity triumphs over prejudice. Until then, treat everyone you meet with the respect they deserve, because you never know who might end up saving your life.